go ahead and give a talk on Jacob Biffle and the 9th Tennessee Cavalry, who was a lot in this area. He's got so much information, we're going to have to make this a two-parter. Instead of trying to cram everything into a short 45 or 1 hour presentation, we're going to do 2 meetings. We're going to do part 1 tonight, and then we're going to carry it over next month and let him finish it up. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Greg and let him take it away.
Thanks, John.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm delighted to be here with you guys, talk about Biffle's 9th Tennessee Cavalry. And sometimes it was called the 19th. And that's actually its official designation.
That was based off my dumb question last week.
That was Lee's dumb question. Lee sent me a thing when we set it up, and he said, "Hey, should I put the 9th or the 19th?" Well, that's been confusion ever since the 1860s, even during the Civil War. I probably will get to it just a hair in this first part, but most of when I talk about when that occurred will be in the second part of the presentation. We've got this picture of a Union soldier here, so from the 15th Kentucky Cavalry. Is that correct, Richard?
Yes.
Richard, this is one of Richard's ancestors, and his brother got killed at the same time Biffle's forces were in Tennessee. We'll also talk about that in the second part, but you guys are welcome to come up here and look at that if you get a chance. Okay, so let's get started here. It's a regiment that doesn't have a regimental history. There's some written information about the command out there, such as diaries, logbooks, etc., but they aren't easy to find. Nobody's really assembled a lot of papers on Biffle's command. And likewise, Colonel Biffle, bless his heart, didn't care to write reports, and so you don't have much information out in this regiment in official records and other places you might find those things. However, by putting written accounts that speak of Biffle's command, along with the ORs and those diaries, I've tried to give a presentation here of a command extremely representative of a cavalry command in the Confederate Army in the Western Theater, and in Tennesseans in particular, because of the nature of how the command was formed. The unit was in many ways an elite cavalry corps. Initially trained to fight as fast-moving shock troops and raiders, they were able to fight as infantry later in the war or behind the lines as guerrillas. And we'll see all of that as we go through this presentation. I'd like to make this presentation interactive, so at any point, if any one of you have a question, just raise your hand, ask to be recognized. I'll recognize you, ask a question, I'll try to answer it. So hopefully I'll give you a good answer. Whoops. And I have got to get a little bit better at doing this part of it. So let's get started. Okay, so Jacob Barnett, or Jake Biffle, started out the war forming a company of men from Wayne County, Tennessee, and which became part of the 2nd Battalion, Tennessee Cavalry. This was in the first part of 1861. This is just right after hostilities started. Since he was recruiting the company, he, of course, became its captain. And that's a picture of Biffle. That's the only one I've been able to find. The 2nd Tennessee Battalion Cavalry formed in a camp near Mount Pleasant, Tennessee, not far north of Lawrenceburg. And it stayed there until about the last of July 1861, when it marched north to the Kentucky-Tennessee border. When the Confederates invaded Kentucky in September 1861, the battalion led General Buckner's division into Bowling Green. Biffle's company was sent to Hopkinsville, Kentucky, which is just there in the western part of Tennessee. Give me just a second here. There we go. And along with other infantry commands, and from that point participated in an attack on a federal camp called Joe Underwood on October 24th, 1861. This attack is only significant because a Biffle researcher told me that Biffle's descendants believe that agreements occurred here that ultimately caused his death years later after the Civil War. Now, that's an interesting thing, because we'll get to that. We probably won't talk about it again to the second part, but just keep that in the back of your mind. At the time, according to Lieutenant Colonel James Lewis, who wrote a history of that battalion, Biffle's company met the enemy in 1 or 2 engagements there. George Barham, private of Company E from Perry County, was killed, and another soldier of Company D from Wayne County was shot, and they were the first Confederate soldiers killed in Buckner's division, which later became part of the Army of Tennessee. The same company would have the last soldier killed in North Carolina in 1865 at the end of the war for the Army of Tennessee, which is kind of ironic. In December, the 2nd Tennessee Battalion's commander resigned, and Biffle was elected the new lieutenant colonel by the men. So went from captain to lieutenant colonel of that battalion. In February, March 1862, Biffle would retreat with Confederate units from Nashville to Decatur after the capture of Fort Donelson. And at that point, General Albert Sidney Johnson would name him the post commander of Decatur and ordered him to protect the railroad bridge connecting Chattanooga with Corinth, located there. Now, all he had was his battalion of cavalry and a small 2 or 3 companies of Alabama infantry that hadn't formed yet. Confusion reigned later when General Beauregard ordered Biffle's battalion to Corinth for the upcoming battle at Shiloh, but Biffle did not come with his men, nor was he found in command of his post at Decatur. So after the battle, Beauregard wanted answers. He discovered Biffle wasn't with his men, and Biffle wasn't at Decatur, and 2 days after the battle of Shiloh, he sent a telegram to Decatur to essentially evacuate the post. Biffle's battalion had already left to go to Corinth, as I mentioned earlier, and Beauregard asked for an explanation from Biffle on where he's at, what's going on. And that telegram is right there on the left, and Biffle's explanation is there on the right, and those came out of the National Archive. Biffle responds that he was sick, and that his cavalry battalion had left for Shiloh as ordered under Major Carls, his second in command. He also notes that he left the Decatur post in command of Major Hawkins, who commanded about 250 Alabamians there. He also makes a comment that he was sick, and his surgeon had ordered him home for rest. And this seemed to be an okay explanation, but later Biffle, under orders, put his command under Colonel Morgan for a raid into Tennessee. Y'all all know who Morgan was. He doesn't comply. Again, Beauregard asks for an explanation. Biffle responds that his unit is fatigued due to constant scouting and picketing and wasn't ready to undertake such a mission without some rest prepared. In May, under orders from Beauregard, Biffle's battalion is combined with another, which was the 11th Tennessee Battalion, to form a regiment initially called the 1st Tennessee Cavalry, and elections are held in which Biffle is elected colonel. This regiment, like most all Tennessee cavalry regiments, has got 3 or 4 numbers for its name. This one later became the Wheeler's 6th Cavalry. So the initial colonel for that unit is Biffle. When Corinth is evacuated later that month, Biffle's command on the outskirts of the city defenses, southwest of town, probably out toward Kossuth in that area, is not notified of the order to evacuate, and when they find out that the Confederates have evacuated, the Union forces have come in, they're in charge of Corinth, and his route to get back to the lines is blocked. And his command actually has to cut their way out to get back to Confederate lines. I didn't find any question or for an explanation on this point from Beauregard to Biffle. But what we did have is a very short time later, the War Department orders new elections for his regiment with no reason given. And Biffle was not re-elected colonel. The picture, I already mentioned about the picture. And so, on June 14th in Chickasaw, Mississippi, after losing his bid for a re-election as colonel, Biffle submits his resignation letter, shown here. And there's a couple reasons why. Of course, the first reason is he's no longer in charge of the regiment, but in April 1862, the Partisan Ranger Act has been passed by the Confederate Congress. The goal is to recruit units behind enemy lines and give those units official designation, keeping soldiers that stay behind enemy lines legal status. Because if you're behind enemy lines and you're not in uniform, or if you are in uniform but you don't have an official unit regiment, technically you'd be shot as a saboteur or spy, whatever they want to make. A guerrilla was subject to be shot at any time. And so that's one reason for the act. Plus I figured, but the real thing is recruiters use the verbiage in the act to entice soldiers to join up in this type of organization, basically asserting that they wouldn't have to travel far from their homes. I mean, if you're fighting behind enemy lines, that's where you're going to be fighting at, right there by your house. So, at this point in the war, in June of 1862, Union forces controlled all of the western and middle Tennessee and most of Alabama along the Tennessee River, except the area just outside of Chattanooga. Biffle, on June 13th, the day before this resignation letter, applies to form a partisan ranger regiment. He sends this letter to General Bragg, since he didn't win re-election as colonel. He states more or less that there are hundreds at home behind enemy lines that would join a partisan ranger organization, and he has 11 or 12 gentlemen who happen to be officers in other commands of ability are ready to start in Tennessee to help him recruit. Biffle states in the letter he only wants the best men for his new unit and requests that he get his former company along with his captain James Mitchell as the nucleus for the new regiment. Based on what we know afterwards, Biffle doesn't get Captain Mitchell or his old company, as they remained with their own regiment. However, Biffle gets approved to form a new regiment, and based on the captains, they all resigned from units that they were serving in, or their terms expired, and they did go into Tennessee behind Union lines and help form those units. One of those captains is Captain James Mary Reynolds, and we know from his logbook that Biffle appears to have been allowed to take several officers with him into Tennessee. Captain Reynolds at the time was a lieutenant in the 54th Tennessee Infantry, which had companies formed from men in Wayne and Lawrence counties, Tennessee. Biffle's recruitment of this new regiment would be a model that the Confederates would try to use out the war in Tennessee behind enemy lines. One observation from Reynolds' logbook during this time period is his comments about one William Rowland, shown in the slide above. If I can get this up here, there it comes. Let's see if I can get this, try this again. Well, for some reason, not showing. Rowland from Lawrence County, Tennessee, had enlisted in the 54th Tennessee Regiment, but deserted and joined a Union regiment just prior to the battle. So for whatever reason, early in the war, he joins a Confederate regiment, and right before the battle, he switches sides and joins up with an Iowa regiment. Rowland was captured at Shiloh, recognized by soldiers in his former regiment, tried by court-martial, and executed. Jeez. The execution order, I thought I had here on the left, and Reynolds' logbook comments on the right, so it may be this next one. Wayne County, Tennessee was an epicenter of divided loyalties, much like the mountain counties of North Alabama. Rowland's desertion and execution was an example of the strife between neighbors. Biffle and his officers infiltrated past Union encampments in the Tennessee River Valley. Whoops, let's go here. And so here is, actually I do have it on the next slide, there's something wasn't showing up correctly. But there is the execution letter for Rowland, and there's some excerpts from Reynolds' logbook about that execution.
You said it's interactive, right?
Uh-huh.
Oh. That county voted to remain in the Union.
That's correct.
Was it, it's almost 2-to-1, or is?
Probably, yeah. Wayne County had a tremendous amount of Union sentiment in the county. Most of the Confederate sentiment was along the Buffalo River, in Indian Creek in the north part of Wayne County, and the strip along the Lauderdale County line. There's Confederate.
Yeah, I've got ancestors, 2 brothers fought in Nixon's and Ives, 48th and 54th Infantry, and their other brother, John, fought in the 2nd Tennessee Mounted Infantry from the same family from Wayne County.
So you got a lot of, this county has a lot of brother against brother. If you go look at counties and names, you'll see brewers that are against one another.
Bratchers, mine were Bratchers.
Yeah, Bratchers.
My family in Lincoln County was divided.
Your family, okay.
One was almost executed, but because he was a brother Mason, the guy's father, he snuck him out of the smokehouse that night and they didn't hang him the next day.
We're gonna probably get to Masons here in a second, so that's I'm glad you mentioned that. But yeah, there's a lot of things, dynamics going on during this time period around those things. So Biffle and his officers infiltrated past Union encampments in the Tennessee River Valley, and quietly went to work gathering up recruits. Their work seemed to go unnoticed by Union forces along the railroads in the Tennessee River Valley. All right, this map shows a situation in the summer of 1862. The Union lines are indicated by the blue dashed line that you can see here. In other words, up in this area is Union control. Confederates are below this line. They're protecting Chattanooga, they're at Tennessee. And the Union forces are advancing along the railroad toward Chattanooga, west to east, and getting the National Railroad, which is this one right here, back in shape to utilize it as a supply line. The area that Biffle and his captains are recruiting is this area in red, which I've circled here on the map. And they're behind Union lines, but their activities go essentially undisturbed. There's just not enough Union soldiers in the area to really patrol that point in the war. In late August 1862, Bragg's Confederate Army moves from Tupelo, Mississippi to Chattanooga, Tennessee, and from there begins an invasion of Kentucky, shown in red here, forcing Union evacuation of North Alabama. And that's shown in these 2 blue lines. They have to follow him as he moves north into Kentucky, and this actually causes all this area in here to be freed up and go over to Confederate control. Union regimental history has reported that small mounted bands harassed their movements northwards on the retreat to Kentucky, but did little harm, but picking up stragglers and soldiers who wandered too far away from the main column, foraging. However, on August 5th, 1862, one of these bands, led by Captain Frank Gurley, you've heard of Gurley, Alabama, that's who's named after him, dashed into the rear of a Union column near New Market, Alabama, and killed an ailing Brigadier General Robert L. McCook, who was riding in a wagon at the time, supposedly in cold blood. A big contention about that. Gurley wasn't part of Biffle's command, but I mention here because he was involved in forming a partisan ranger company, which later became part of Russell's 4th Alabama Cavalry, and he would fight alongside Biffle's command in the coming months. This event is part of an interesting story with one of Biffle's soldiers that I will talk about later in the second part. Newspapers across the North decried McCook's death as a cold-blooded murder. During this time period, Captain Reynolds in his logbook mentions that the boys got back with a prisoner and a horse. And the day he said this, his location was near Ashland, Wayne County, Tennessee, some 25-30 miles west of the military road. And at that time, Union forces would have been marching up that road. So there's a good chance that even though they're not formed in a regiment yet, they are doing the same thing that Gurley did. More than likely, Union troops that went up the military road were harassed by these companies, and many federal regimental histories speak of those horsemen. Biffle's command probably didn't do much damage as they were poorly armed. I need to point out, though, that many were poorly armed with double-barreled shotguns, which were devastating in close quarter combat and will be utilized throughout the war in those situations. So, Biffle and his captains had very little trouble in forming the new regiment during that late summer of '62. Most of the companies are formed from Wayne County or nearby areas. As you can see here on this display I've got here, where the companies were formed from, which counties most of the men came from. There's also a map showing the names of Kentucky, Tennessee counties. So when you match this up, you get in this area. Captain James Reynolds formed Company B, and we'll be using his logbook quite a bit in this first part. Company B had a great number of its recruits also from northern Lauderdale County, Alabama. J.J. Biffle, and I think James was his first name, was captain of Company A, and he's a cousin of Colonel Biffle, and we'll talk about him. Lewis Kirk, who's the captain of Company C, or D, had recently killed a man right as the war started. He was serving apprentices, prison sentence, and because he volunteered to form a company, he was paroled. We'll have some more information about him during the war, mostly in the second part. Companies K and L of the regiment were formed later in the war when they conducted raids into West Tennessee, gathering up recruits. So most of the men in those two companies weren't there at the start. I would imagine that there was a significant amount of pressure put on neutral and pro-union people in Wayne County to enlist in this command, which Thomas Seifert details in his memoir about Unionists in Wayne County. And so that you have a lot of stuff early in the war where the Confederates have kind of the upper hand now. They've been driven out, now they're back in, and they're putting a lot of pressure on their neighbors who don't have strong Confederate sympathies or are trying to stay neutral. Most of the guys who are pro-unionists have left the county, and they are now trying to form organizations around Nashville. We'll talk about that a little bit later. When Bragg leaves Kentucky, he places his army at Murfreesboro. General Nathan Bedford Forrest is placed in charge of Confederate cavalry on the Army of Tennessee's left flank, which have been along the Tennessee and Duck Rivers, and all the way down to the Alabama line. In late November 1862, Biffle's 9th Tennessee Cavalry is placed under Forrest's command. So let's get into the regiment's first formal military action. On December 10, 1862, General Forrest received orders to go into West Tennessee to destroy and disrupt Union communications. Communications in the Civil War also meant like logistics. And if you're a military officer, you know logistics is probably one of the most important, if not the most important things about a unit. A unit fights with its belly. That's what a lot of officers have talked about, but you also get all your supplies, your replenishment of ammunition, and all those things. The secondary aim for this raid was to obtain better arms for his poorly equipped men. I mean, in a report, some of his soldiers had nothing better than flintlock muskets. As I mentioned, shotguns. Some of them weren't even armed at all. The map here in the display shows the route that his command took during the raid. 5 days after receiving the orders on December 10th, Forrest Brigade crossed the river in West Tennessee on the 15th. In the short interval between then and January 1st, 1863, Forrest Command averaged over 20 miles a day, fought 3 well-contested engagements with daily skirmishes, destroyed 50 large and small bridges on the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, and broke up so much of the trestle work of the road as to render the railroad useless until after the war. And that's a big deal. When you tear a railroad up and it's not able to be utilized, that puts a lot of strain on how you're going to get troops resupplied from the north. And it's really a lot bigger deal because, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second here, but the Confederates captured and burned 18 or 20 stockades, captured or killed 2,500 enemy soldiers, took or disabled 10 pieces of field artillery, captured 50 wagons and ambulances with their teams. 10,000 stands of small arms and 1 million rounds of ammunition. So that's a good bit of stuff they're able to take back with them.
10,000?
10,000.
That's a lot.
And as far as armaments go, Forrest left on December 10th or 11th with woeful preparation of weapons, as I mentioned earlier, and supplies, and returned with each man fully armed and his unit carrying a surplus of 500 Enfield rifles. An Enfield rifle was considered the finest rifle of the 1860s, if not the war, when you're talking about a musket-loaded rifle. The railroad was so torn up that it went essentially unused for the rest of the war as a Union logistical supply line. This raid, along with Van Dorn's that occurred in North Mississippi, prompted General U.S. Ulysses Grant to give up his design and take in Vicksburg via land route through central Mississippi. So it actually changed Union plans on how they were going to capture Vicksburg, and it probably set them back 2 or 3 months. It made capturing Vicksburg much more difficult by the destruction of that railroad. And you can see here the path that they took through here, all the way into Kentucky, and then back down through this way where they fought this battle at Parker's Crossroads. And Parker's Crossroads is actually, you can go there now. It's a military site, and we're fixing to talk about it a little bit more. This is Captain Reynolds' logbook depicting his activities on the raid. One thing to note is the fact they were capturing arms because of his documentation of those items being given out to some of his men during the raid. He also documents capturing and paroling a prisoner, David Sims. He also states that he's captured in the Battle of Parker's Crossroad. So going to Parker's Crossroad, you can see that the historical marker here, along with the Confederate troop organizations that participated in the battle, over here on the right. The battle was the last and largest engagement of the campaign. The fighting was a back and forth brawl, with Union reinforcements reaching the battlefield in time to win a tactical victory and prevent the capture of half the Union forces already engaged. Matter of fact, Forrest was in surrender negotiations with that brigade, with his command, when he was attacked in the rear by the Union brigade coming in as reinforcements. And this is where he made his famous comment that people charge them both ways. Yeah. So Forrest's command, including Biffle's, while being battered, would leave the field unimpeded on its march to the Tennessee River, which they crossed to safety. In this battle, Confederate casualties were around 500, while the Union losses were 300. Captain Reynolds, as we mentioned earlier, wasn't fortunate in this battle. He would suffer a neck wound and was taken prisoner. He was taken to Cavalry, Illinois, put in a cell where he apparently saw friends and perhaps made a sign to them, which goes back to your Mason thing, and he walked away from the prison camp. So let's take a little closer look at that experience. Here's a map showing Cairo, Illinois. It's right in this area here, right where the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers meet. And he's put in the cell that day, and note his entry on the 7th over here about his escape. He got off and went into the cell, found out it was guarded by Yankee friends, went through the guards and left. Now I don't know how, I don't know what to make of that other than what you said. He was a Mason, and that's how they usually talk about other Masons. There's a friend, so apparently he makes a sign, he walks out the gate. And then he marks actually who he stayed with all through this time. And you can actually follow this through kind of find a grave or census records, and you kind of get an idea based on his logbook where his travels were. One thing he talked about, he would mention his logbook on reaching Union City that it was a Union hellhole. And so and the other thing to remember here, and I'm gonna go through these slides pretty quick because it's just showing his journey. It's January 1863, and these winters are cold. That period of time, you have a lot of documentation about how cold the winters is. People are dying of freezing weather and stuff like that. So it's real important for him to find shelter every night. By the 6th night, he's ready to cross the Tennessee River just north of Camden, which is this area here. There's Camden. And on the way, a private go-lightly of his command catches up with us, indicating they're traveling in a group. Whether he's picking up stragglers from his own regiment or other escapees is unknown, but he gives his blanket to go-lightly who's been injured and doesn't have one. The other thing from this law book you get is the fact that there's a lot of pro-Confederate sentiment in Western Tennessee and Western Kentucky. Western Kentucky is very pro-Confederate. And so they're very helpful to get this guy out. This map shows the final days of his travel back to Confederate lines, the area along the Tennessee River where the Duck River empties into the Tennessee. Once across the Tennessee River, he's in no man's land, as the area north of the Duck is contested territory. But once he arrives on the Duck south side, he meets soldiers actually from his own regiment who are living and stationed in the area. And so he goes home from there to recuperate from his injury. This is a Civil War era photo of General Grenville Dodge, who was post commander at Corinth at the time of the raid. He's extremely upset about Forrest's raid and the Confederate escape, for he owed much of his late promotion by General Grant to his command post at Corinth due to his work on that railroad in West Tennessee. He'd actually got it patched up so Grant could use it as supply line. Grant was so impressed that he named him the commander of the west part of, I can't remember the corps name right now. But Dodge would have to put his command on half rations for several weeks due to the disruption of his supply line. Dodge and the 9th Tennessee Cavalry would see more of each other in the coming year. Besides the newspaper article shown in the picture above discussing Dodge's situation, and he said, on the 16th of January, 1863, Dodge wrote his brother, "My command have been on half rations for a long time and have had to forage for my animals. There's not a thing left to eat for 30 miles around." And that's the newspaper article talking about supplies being cut off and the destruction of the railroad, and his command being on half rations.
Hey, Greg,
Yep,
my question. Parker's Crossroads was fought on the 31st of December, right?
that's correct. 1862.
Yeah, at that time, the Battle of Stones River was going on.
That's correct.
Did Bragg not call Forrest back? Who
Well,
was taking care of
you got to
Scouts?
think, Rosen, when he sent him across the Tennessee River,
Right,
you don't just go across the Tennessee River real easy.
Yeah.
He's got to have so he's got rafts built, stuff like that. Then he's got to hide them out because he's in behind enemy lines technically. The other thing you got going on is Union gunboats are patrolling,
true.
so he has to be careful of that. And the other thing is at the time Bragg sends him, Bragg's the one that's ordered him into West Tennessee.
Yeah.
When Bragg orders him over there, he's not going to communicate until he gets back across the Tennessee River.
But he basically had to go Cavalry.
That's right. And he gets back across on January 1st, and I'm sure there's a courier there telling him, hey, you need to go back to Murfreesboro as fast as you can.
Yeah.
There's a battle going on. So, as a matter of fact, that's the comment I got here in my notes. When Biffle's cavalry returned back over the Tennessee River, they discovered that Bragg's army had been defeated at Murfreesboro, and now the Confederate line along the Duck River was in jeopardy, as the main army was now centered at Tullahoma, Tennessee. General Bragg asked for cavalry reinforcements from General Johnson to help hold the rich forage area along the Duck River, and he received them when Major General Ernest Van Dorn marched his cavalry division from Mississippi across the Tennessee River at Florence into the area held by Forrest's command. Once there, Forrest's brigade will have to report to General Van Dorn, as General Van Dorn outranks Forrest. And that was another reason Bragg wanted a West Pointer over that command, and because Van Dorn was the senior commander. Biffle's command is now located around Columbia, Tennessee, with some companies situated as pickets along the Duck River and Tennessee Rivers, which wouldn't be far from their homes in most cases. Reynolds' logbook shown here reflects the drilling that took place once Van Dorn and West Pointer arrives. So now they're getting formal training. I don't see anything that indicates they did much of any kind of training in his logbook before this, but he talks about being on drill, talks about dress parades, and there's a little bit of discipline brought to that unit and a little bit of tactics brought to them. And the diary also indicates the headaches of just being an officer. he shows that making payroll wasn't easy. And if you look up there, he's constantly working on that payroll, trying to figure it out, because men like to get paid, and they like to get paid correctly. You also see another item in this part of his logbook, 2 soldiers that left the command on February 20. And this is quite common with Biffle's command, and it goes back to the partisan ranger designation, where they believe they can come and go as they need to. Biffle's men are stationed near their homes, and they should be able to travel whenever there when they wish, if there's no need for them to be at the army and fighting. I imagine having to do drill would make several of them want to head back to the house. Private Stephen A. Jordan, according to his diary, he was in Biffle's command, spent more of his time at his nearby home than in camp during this time, missing most of the engagements that the unit would have during the first part of 1863. So, the next significant engagement they had was the Battle of Thompson Station. And in early March 18, everybody know here where Thompson Station is? It's just north of Spring Hill, Tennessee, right there.
My great-great-grandfather's brother turned 16 after he was captured there.
Okay, so he actually got captured in this spot.
He was in the Indiana regiment.
Okay.
William Perry Stoops.
So he was in the 33rd Indiana, I believe it was.
We're talking about it at breakfast, maybe, right?
So in early March 1863, 2,500 federal troops in Franklin advanced out to probe Confederate strength along the Nashville and Decatur Railroad. On March 5th, Biffle's 9th Cavalry, along with much of Van Dorn's and Forrest's command, would fight the Battle of Thompson Station, which resulted in 1,450 Union casualties, most of which were captured. Confederates would suffer 350. A lot of those, and they had a very high killed-wounded ratio. This fighting was desperate. A lot of it was close quarters. Biffle's command played a prominent role in the battle as they held the Confederate right flank, and part of Biffle's command would swing around the Union left flank and gain their rear, cutting off their retreat. In this action, Captain Reynolds would gain recognition in Forrest's official report of battle for capturing the 19th Michigan's colors, which was the 19th Michigan Infantry. And that's in the official records. He doesn't mention this in his diary, shown here in the picture to the left of this painting. This painting's done by
John Paul Strain,
and this is an actual painting. He's trying to depict maybe something that's happening in that Thompson Station. Another noted feat during this engagement, the decisive climax of the battle, right before the Union forces surrendered during a charge, Private Clay Kendrick of Company F of Biffle's Cavalry caught the Confederate flag as it was falling and held it aloft until his wrist was broken by a bullet. Private Kendrick would be wounded again later this summer and left to be captured in Jackson, Tennessee. And that happened in the summer of 1863, and that's some of the units there that possibly were involved that related to that sword there. The battle was significant at the time because it delayed General William Rosecrans' designs for a move at Bragg, fearing that he didn't have enough cavalry to deal with the Confederates. He complained in his official dispatches of not having enough cavalry and that he needed more horses to mount soldiers for those regiments or just have mounted infantry. And so these things, he is really frustrated because his units are less mobile than the Confederates, and the Confederates can get troops there going back to the first with the most. And that's what Confederates were really doing with their cavalry. They were fighting this mounted infantry. So they had no issues fighting infantry commands. After Thompson Station, Biffle's unit is in constant contact with federal troops operating out of Franklin. Reynolds' logbook shown in the picture documents skirmishing with the Union troops, and then on March 21st, the order is given to cook 3 days of rations. Invariably, this means an operation is about to take place, and you see that quite often in other diaries and other documents from the war. On Tuesday the 24th, the command started out to ride around Franklin and attack the railroad supply net from Nashville at the Brentwood, Tennessee depot. The operation was a huge success, with the railroad being broken up, supply lines, and the bridge over the Little Harpeth River burned. Federal troops, surprised by the large number of Confederates in the rear, put up very little resistance. The Confederates escaped less than 60 casualties, while the Federal suffered up to 800 men in losses, most of those again captured. Union Major General William S. Rosecrans was so disgusted with the lack of fight on the part of his infantry at Brentwood that he ordered the Union commander there court-martial. Rosecrans continued to request the ability to get more cavalry from General Howlett in Washington, and needed them operational before he would advance. Moving out of Murfreesboro toward Tullahoma, where the Army of Tennessee, Confederate Army of Tennessee was located. Another note from Reynolds' logbook here, at the end of March, we can see the born life sometimes of a soldier with the comment, still in camps, still in camps, still in camps. That's it, still in camp. So you see that more in infantry. What I find in the cavalry, especially as the war gets on, the cavalry stays active constantly.
Got back to camps and it's still in camps.
Yeah.
Hey Greg,
Yes, sir.
on that last slide that talks about Hillsborough, where is that? Reason why I asked, there's a Hillsborough down around Tullahoma.
Well, the old Hillsborough pipe between.
It's gotta be close to Spring Hill.
Well, that's what I wondered, it could be that other one that I was thinking about.
It possibly could, but I don't think so. I think this is the one close to Spring Hill. The picture here shows Reynolds' entries during the first part of April. On April 10th, part of Forrest Command, while moving towards Franklin, was attacked while in column, means a traveling formation, and in full, meaning they were attacked on the flank by the 3rd U.S. Cavalry. U.S. troopers were able to capture Freeman's battery. Captain Samuel L. Freeman was shot at point-blank range in the head, and actually the mouth, after being captured because he couldn't keep up on foot with the retreating Union troopers. Supposedly he got a knee injury. Does anybody here know about knee injuries? Somebody does, right? So he couldn't come up and he got shot. The picture shows the monument and cannon erected at the site just south of Franklin, Tennessee. Have any of you guys been there? However, Captain Joseph G. Vale, who was a member of Minnie's Cavalry Brigade, wrote that the 4th U.S. Cavalry lost 5 men killed and 18 wounded in this engagement. As was the custom of the rebels, after meeting a mishap, they, in this instance, invented a cock and bull story to the fact that Captain Freeman was murdered by an officer of the 4th after he had surrendered and while a prisoner in their hands on their retreat. The object being to give a color of excuse for atrocities committed by themselves and to create a bitter, bloodthirsty feeling on the part of their soldiers against efficient cavalry regiments in general and the 4th Regulars in particular. Sergeant Major Strickland killed Captain Freeman in a fair fight, and Captain Freeman's bravery required no false statements such as made to perpetuate his memory. Now, there's a lot of Confederate stories that go against that. This is not just the one I gave you, just not the one, but that's the Union side. And again, it's similar to McCook's. Just flip the page. On the McCook side, it was a cold-blooded murder. On the Confederate side, they said, no, the guy was resisting and he was deserved to be shot.
What's interesting about that is Gurley afterwards, they wanted to put him in jail and everything, and I believe in Huntsville, they voted for him to be sheriff.
Yeah. Well, he's actually tried during the war.
Mm-hmm.
Supposedly Parr sent a regiment of notes saying he was executed and all the officers that he held in prison would be executed. I don't know if that's true or not. That's something I've read. However, Gurley was not ever, Gurley survived the war. I have to go back and look at what happened during the trial and when he was released. But he was captured later in 1863. But there was a revenge kill, and it's interesting because I'm going to note it here. Captain Kirk of Company D. I don't know why I always get those two companies mixed up. Captain Kirk of Company D was wounded here, and he may have seen Captain Freeman shot down from a distance as his command would have been pursuing the Yankees. Now, the irony in all this is that later I'll talk about Kirk being imprisoned, according to the New York Times, about the death of McCook. After a couple of weeks of inactivity, Biffle's command was to start on one of its most memorable achievements. From Tullahoma, Tennessee, General Johnson sent a telegram to the War Department in Richmond that Colonel Roddy's command had lost Tuscumbia and federal forces were halfway to Decatur. He notes, and that's a telegram on April 25th, 1863. He notes that General Bragg on April 23rd had ordered General Forrest to join Roddy's command. So where is Forrest? You know, a lot of people, always gets me that people will talk about Garrison's Raid, which happened at the same time, went through Mississippi and did the Vicksburg, but that was done to keep Forrest off of it. I mean, to keep, that Straits Raid, part of Straits Raid Dodges was to keep Forrest. I don't see how in the world Forrest is gonna go from Spring Hill, Tennessee, catching a cavalry force that's all the way through central Mississippi by the time they know what's going on. Anyway, all that being said, on April 24th, the day of the order, Forrest's command included Colonel Biffle's 9th Tennessee were en route toward Colonel Philip Dale Roddy's command, and they were traveling from Spring Hill, Tennessee. They crossed the Tennessee River at Brown's Ferry on the 27th, utilizing a steamboat, and engaged General Dodge's Union command the next day on the 28th at Town Creek. Forrest sent General George Gibbs DeBrail's 8th Tennessee Cavalry along with 2 artillery pieces to Florence to give General Dodge the impression that General Van Dorn's whole command had come down from Tennessee to cut off his line of communication back to Corinth. Dodge in his memoirs validates this contention by DeBrail. DeBrail had written this in his memoir, and that he actually pulled off of moving forward toward Decatur, helping Strait because of this ruse that the Confederates did. During the same day, Forrest learned from, I believe it was Moon, what was the guy's name? Moon, who was a scout for Roddy, that there was a federal cavalry command that had moved away from the main Union force and was heading to Moulton. Command was a raiding party of 1,800 Union infantrymen mounted on mules under Colonel Albert Strait. Roddy, DeBrail, and just before we get to the next discussion of this Straits Raid, just a few notes about the pictures here. That's General Roddy right there, Dale Roddy. What's his middle name?
Philip
Roddy.
Philip Dale.
Philip Dale.
And this here is George Gibbs DeBrail, who wrote a history of the 8th Tennessee. And bless his heart, helped me out because he talks about Biffle's command a lot because he was over him. So without him, I wouldn't know near as much about what happened with Biffle's command later in the war. And then this, of course, is General Grenville Dodge, who was at Decatur at the time, eventually is going to move over to Pulaski. And this is General Abel Strait. The display here shows the movement of Strait's forces during the raid. And you can see here, he leaves Nashville just opposite of where Forrest's command is, down around, south of Franklin, goes to Palmyra, Yellow Creek, over to Fort Henry, where they get on boats, land at Eastport. And during this time, they're having trouble with all their mules and different things. And I'm not going to get into the details of Dodge's expedition to Corinth. You could do a whole presentation about this whole event. But anyway, he's here headed toward Moulton, fixing to head down here. His route is to get to Rome, destroy a Confederate arsenal there, and also tear up the railroad between Atlanta and Chattanooga. And this would precipitate the start of Rosecrans's move toward Chattanooga from Murfreesboro. If you look here, this is how Forrest was command moved. Is basically they went straight here, across the river at Brown's Ferry, ended up fighting at Town Creek, and then from there they started chasing Strait's raiders. And he only, and accordingly, he only took Biffle's command, parts of Roddy command, and maybe a few other pieces of Tennessee regiments with him, because he still wasn't sure Dodge was going to not go back. He didn't know if his ruse was going to work, so he had to still leave troops behind to face Dodge and follow Dodge back down the valley. The Confederate force following Strait were somewhere around 500 to 800 in number, chasing nearly 1,800 Federals, mainly those on mules. The good luck for them is Strait had no idea how large the force was that was chasing him. On April 30th, Forrest caught up with Strait at Days Gap, fighting a significant engagement there. Strait, having stung the Confederates there, would continue eastward but failed to shake off the rebels. Biffle's command would be victorious when on May 3rd, Strait surrendered his worn-out forces to the rebels at Cedar Bluff, Alabama. General Rosecrans, as I mentioned earlier, planned the raid to help set up his advance toward Chattanooga. The setback delayed his timetable once again, and again he continued to press his higher-ups for more mounts for his troops. It would be 7 more weeks before the Union forces would attempt to engage the Confederates in Middle Tennessee. Halleck got so tired of him telegraphing those requests that he told him basically to quit. And I wish I had gotten that here, but that's one of the every now and then when you're looking at this stuff, you get tickled over some kind of note you see between generals, and this is one of them. So,
Greg, how many mules did Biffle and Forrest have compared to Strait?
well, most of their command didn't have mules, and that was an advantage. But before you discount mules, if you're being chased, is not a good thing.
Yeah.
But mules, if you're just mounted infantry and you're being the aggressor, that's not so bad because you're infantry, you're advancing, you're not necessarily infantry has a totally different mindset than cavalry forces. Cavalry forces are trained with a horse, and back then, they always knew them horses were behind them. So if things got tough, they didn't have any trouble at all getting to the horses. Infantry, man, you knew you're going to run so far, and you're going to run out of steam. So the way people fought, and you can see that in these engagements, infantry 99 times out of 100 pushed cavalry back and did so regularly, even when the cavalry was fairly well armed. But Rosecrans eventually got his wish, and Confederate Union cavalry, would be the same number as Confederates, plus they would get better arms. They started getting repeated rifles. Let's take a look at Captain Reynolds' logbook, and this is the last slide. Let's take a look at his logbook during this time. He shows the journey of Biffle's command, and interesting note on the logbook is on the 29th. When Biffle's command left Town Creek to chase Strait, he's on picket and he's lost the command. Now, one thing I noticed about Reynolds is that when he's traveling, a lot of times he's going to make sure he stays in somebody's home. And I'm not sure, he didn't document it here, but might have been on picket, decided to stay at somebody's house. Anyway, the command, he doesn't find out they're leaving and he gets left behind. On Monday, May 11th, that was the last log, unfortunately for us, that was the last logbook entry Reynolds made related to documenting where he was and what activity he was doing. There's some other things he did that we can share later, but as far as his logbook, this is it. And because of comments written in the Booker Saga, I always wondered if Reynolds was removed from command of Company B, and his first lieutenant, one William Rufus Chisholm, promoted to captain of Company B in his place, because the Booker Saga talks about him being over Captain B, Company B, I'm sorry. And so it's kind of one of those mysteries we may not never know. In the Booker Saga, it mentions that another comment about some of Biffle's troops is that Clay Pruitt was given a dispatch for Colonel Roddy and was told to round his brother, the Chisholms and the Howells up in the Pruitton area, which is up there along Butler Creek, and get the soldiers themselves to Roddy's command and report. Apparently, according to the saga, there was a great mule stampede at Tuscumbia caused by this outfit utilizing cats, hornets' nests, and yellow jackets. Sneaking in the corral in the middle of the night, letting loose the chosen instruments of discord to spook the animals. So mules could be spooked. I imagine horses would be spooked that way too. And this supposedly happened at Tuscumbia. According to the official records, there was a mule stampede near Eastport that was done by Roddy's command, but I can't find anything near Tuscumbia. And it's hard to believe this wouldn't have been documented somewhere. But it could have been related to Dodge's retreat, as I'm sure Roddy's men had come in boasting about their achievements near Eastport with their mule stampede there.
I love their phrase, chosen instruments of discord.
Yeah.
Nobody writes like that anymore.
That's right. One thing that was mentioned was that Forest Man, which means Biffle's man, in order to go home on furlough, would claim that their horse was lost and would be allowed to go home to get another. Many times they would sell the horses to Texans and then produce the excuse. According to Pruitt's book, Forrest knew about it because he didn't want to lose Texans to the infantry. Because if you didn't have a horse, you went from the cavalry to the infantry.
Yeah.
Because they were dismounted, knew the locals were better horse thieves. In other words, Forrest's book is, hey, okay, I'll look the other way, and my local guys can go get my horse, I know they'll be able to. The Booker saga states Clay Pruitt was once ready to go on the furlough, and Forrest told him, no, Clay, damn it, no. This is the third time you stole and sold the same horse during this company stay here, and I know you. So he didn't get to go on that furlough. At the and then going back to what we're talking about furloughs again, at the time of Straight's raid, Private Jordan in his diary notes, he had received an inoculation, probably a smallpox thing, and his arm became stiff and he stayed home to recover. 5 weeks.
Wow.
So, and this would change, but I'm on, and one of the things I have seen is that when you see a lot of these captures, you follow POW records, is something I'm trying to put together, is you see a lot of this happen with Biffle's command, but also other commands where basically these Tennesseans are going back behind the lines, behind Union lines, and they're at home and they get reported on and people show up and take them and they become prisoners. And Dodge was really good at that. That was one of his focuses. And this other thing that happened up here on Tuesday, May 5th, Colonel Cooper, that's Lieutenant Colonel Albert Cooper, who is Biffle's second in command. We'll talk a little bit more about him in the second part too. So, we're talking about the end of part one. What's next? When we talk about this the next time, we're going to talk about the West Tennessee raid in the summer of 1863, and we'll get to discuss a little bit of this at that time. Chickamauga, the home front in Wayne and Lauderdale counties in October and January 63, 64, which is very interesting because there's a lot of strife going on at that time. That's when Sherman's marching through, Dodge is coming through. The area really had a lot of, lack of a better term, martial law until that time. The Knoxville campaign, they're on that. The Atlanta campaign, where they fight as infantry quite a bit. Wheeler September raid. It really gets confusing what happens to Biffle between Wheeler 64 raid and Forrest 64 raid and Hood's Tennessee campaign. I'm going to try to sort that out. There's a couple things, and if you ever go in there and you read the summary, you'll see there's a lot of confusion by even people who wrote the summary. Where's Biffle's forces? Where they turn out, they're just about in a lot of different places at the same time. And there's reasons for that. And maybe I can explain that.